Hi, and welcome to Module 6 of our supervisor training. I'm Dr. Kristen Kinsevich, Assistant Professor at Evangel University and Licensed Professional Counselor. In this module, we're going to talk about evaluating the student. And so we'll go through all kinds of specifics around direct observation, formative evaluation, and summative evaluation. So let's start with direct observation. There are several different ways that you can directly observe your student or supervisee, and so we're going to go through several of them. One is live observation methods, and there's a few different ways that you can go ahead and actually watch your supervisee or student as they are delivering therapy. We can also record them, and we'll talk about observation methods for that. There's co-therapy models, and then we go into specifically what we're looking for when we're observing a student or a supervisee. So let's talk about live observation. I'm actually going to move my, I don't know if I can. Well, I don't think I can move myself, so I'm sorry I'm covering a little bit of the text there. But first of all, we can sit in on a session. So obviously that can create some different dynamics in the room with the client and the student. The student might feel nervous, the client might feel watched, and so it's important to normalize this experience, have the room set up in a way that is appropriate, where you are not really in the normal visual field of the student and the supervisee, maybe in a corner or to the side somewhere. Or if the room doesn't allow for that, you may actually intentionally sit in a more triangular formation where you are kind of there and part of it, so you're not awkwardly kind of half hiding, but kind of they're still aware of you being there. It's just important to establish norms and expectations, introduce yourself to the client, explain that your student is in training and that part of training is observation. And of course, the client should have given their consent for this, and hopefully you've already kind of planned ahead and is not surprised by this information. But of course, you want to maintain boundaries so you don't, in this observation approach, unlike some other supervision techniques that we've talked about in earlier modules, you don't want to interrupt or kind of participate, but really you're just there to observe. And it's important to explain that in front of the client. And then after the client leaves, it's really helpful just immediately after the session to do a post-session debrief with your supervisee. That way you can just kind of hear from them. How do they think it went? What are some of the things they felt were really strong? And what were some of the moments that they feel like they, if they could rewind and go back, they would maybe change some things. Even ask them, how did it feel to be observed? What was coming up? What happened in the session maybe because of that? Maybe there was some anxiety or things that are not typical behaviors, in their session, but came up in this particular one because you were present. So you can talk about that. Now, if you have the advantage of having a setup with a one-way mirror, then that certainly is a way to observe without kind of some of this awkwardness. And it may be less common just because of facility limitations, but a computer setup can actually do the same thing. And so if you have the student set up the computer in a way that captures either just them or them and the client, depending on kind of what the consent says about recording and what you want to be able to have on file. Sometimes you would set up the computer in such a way that you're not seeing the client. But if you're not recording this, it's not saved anywhere, then it's probably best to see the student and the client so you can observe the body language of both. And so basically kind of like a Zoom call type of setup, whatever is a HIPAA compliant, secure type of web call. You can do that, and then you mute yourself and hide your camera so that they don't see you, but you can see them. And so you're essentially watching as if it's a one-way mirror. And again, if the computer is set up in an unobtrusive way, then generally the student and the client kind of forget about it after a while, and they just go about having their session. This allows you to take notes during the observation, which can be very helpful, and again, less interference with the client. Now, the bug in the ear or interrupting session, that's part of some of those more unusual supervision techniques. We talked about that in an earlier module. So you can make a plan in advance. You want the client to be aware. This would be something if you're doing this regularly, that it's part of kind of the normal supervision training. Now, I don't know too many people that do the bug in the ear. That's something that I think the Palo Alto group came up with, and they do some pretty innovative things. And they were experimenting with techniques. So if you have some type of, you know, actual device in the supervisee's ear, you can kind of talk to them, but the client isn't aware of that. Again, super high tech stuff that you're probably not going to have on hand, but I just figured I would mention. And then also, let's say you are in the same building with the supervisee, and you're observing either through that one-way mirror or a webcam of some kind. That there could be a plan for interrupting the session, and again, that would be something the client would know, the supervisee would know, and you would have a plan for how and when to go about doing that. You might even build in pauses into the session to kind of huddle up with your supervisee and then have them go back. So again, that's a little bit more into the direct supervision pieces than just purely observation, but certainly it kind of marries here a little bit. And then telehealth, if your student or supervisee is delivering a session via telehealth, then that can also work if you're able to be a third member in the call. And again, turn off your camera and your microphone. Then that's also possible. You don't have to be in the same location with them, and even the client may be in a totally different location as well. So all three of you may be remote, but you're able to kind of observe that. The other thing that they can do, and we'll get into this in the next slide here, is record. So let's talk about that. First of all, we want to make sure that if the student is planning to record a session, that they have chosen a client who is appropriate for that. It might be that they want to choose, their gold star, like perfect client so that they can kind of show off to you or to their peers. But we really actually want to encourage our students to pick a challenging client for them, someone that makes them a little nervous or they're not sure what to do, because that's when you can get really good feedback. If you just kind of show off your skills with your best client, then it's not really a formative experience. Of course, you should have some type of consent form that the client signs just as part of your agency practice regarding recordings, how they're handled, who views them, and that they're giving consent for that. And if it's audio recording versus video, different agencies handle that differently as well. Generally, our students are required to record at least one session per semester. You could do that more often, one a month or something like that, to work with your student in a more hands-on way. And so in that case, again, your agency would have to have their own kind of consent form. Our students have a consent form that they sign for any recordings that we are going to see because that's part of their school experience. So the supervisee needs to make sure that the recording can be heard. So they want to make sure they have a good microphone or good acoustics in the room, that they've kind of tested that out before the client comes. And then once the recording has been done, they want to select a segment, usually a 10-minute segment that they're going to share. Preferably, a segment that, again, shows that they're having a little bit of a struggle or challenge. They could also have run into some agencies that absolutely will not allow recording of any kind, or often with children or, special population prisoners, things like that. And so in that case, what I have sometimes had students do is basically have a session and then immediately afterwards try to transcript out the session, essentially from memory, to the best of their ability. And so they could even pick a short segment of the session and try to really, like, word for word, kind of almost like a play script, write out kind of how the session went. So that's, again, not the best. Obviously, there's some subjectivity there, but it is another way to go about doing it. So before you have a supervision session with the student to go over this recording, you would want to watch the whole session, preferably, or if it's just absolutely not possible, then you can watch the selected clip and take notes on that. So what did you see that went well? Where were some discussion points that you could kind of raise for them, and kind of gather some feedback and some questions. So then during the supervision session, it's helpful to rewatch that clip together. Again, that's why maybe you're aiming for kind of a 10-minute segment. I think it is helpful for you to have seen an entire session. Certainly, we don't want supervisees going into the field and no one's ever seen them complete a whole session start to finish. So several times during their process, it would be good for you to watch the whole entire thing. But within supervision itself, obviously that would take the whole supervision session to just watch it. So you're boiling it down to a 10 or 15-minute clip, watching that together, and be ready to pause. Give them permission to say pause when they want to kind of pause and think about something. And then also, let them know that you may pause at certain times as well. It's great to ask open-ended questions instead of kind of saying, well, you should have done this or you should have done that. We don't want to be advice giving, even though we do want to provide specific feedback. We want that feedback to come in the form of kind of, well, I noticed that you, responded this way or asked this question of the client. What do you think would have happened if you would have asked this other question? Or is there a different direction you could have gone there? So you're giving them specific moments, but the feedback is really kind of letting them self-reflect. And then if they're missing something, to speak into that. But we want to obviously not make it seem like therapy is just kind of there's a right way and a wrong way. Certainly there are some harmful things we could do, but most likely your supervisee is going to make clinical choices, and helping them understand the differences in some of the clinical choices that they make, that there's not one that's right and one that's wrong, but that they produce different kinds of information and lead to different places. So that's helpful. Again, all of this can really be paired with that interpersonal process recall technique that we talked about in an earlier module. So I would encourage you to kind of think of these things as going together. Now, co-therapy models also could be a way that you're observing your student where you are actually, they are a co-therapist with you. Not that they're hopping into your session, but that you start together with a client or two that you both see. And so it's a co-therapy model from the beginning. And so thinking about, is there someone coming onto the caseload that's appropriate for co-therapy, that it would work well for some reason, maybe even a couple or families where there's some group dynamics. And so a co-therapy could work very well. And again, new clients with no prior relationship to either you or the student, you can kind of start with this from the beginning and make it a whole part of how you're building the relationship from the start. So you want to describe this to the client, clarify what is the role of each therapist. Are is there kind of good cop, bad cop kind of thing? Or no, probably not. We're not going to, trick you or, play roles, but that we're going to be ourselves, but we're a team working together. Kind of discussing the boundaries in terms of avoiding splitting. So if the client wants to call one of you up and kind of try to undermine the other one, you want to avoid that. And so again, discussing the benefits and risks of any kind of treatment is important, and obtaining their consent. In session, you want to maintain the roles that have been stated. So how do the two of you work together? You might brainstorm before the sessions, you might debrief after the sessions, but in the session itself, is there one that's taking the lead? Do you take turns? I think it's great for role plays to have multiple people, and so that can be a really helpful way to do it. But to kind of establish, and you don't necessarily want one therapist to always be more dominant than the other. So kind of really seeing it as a mutual approach to therapy. And there's certainly more that you can look into about co-therapy models as well. You definitely want to avoid correcting the supervisee in the session or making them look bad. It should be a shared kind of mutual and collegial kind of relationship. And then in supervision, certainly keeping debrief open-ended. Hey, how do you think the session went? Instead of, well, you did this or that. Asking for their input on how you're handling things. What are they observing in you? Are there things, directions you took it that they actually thought it could have gone a different way? Let them give you constructive criticism as well. And then brainstorming about clinical next steps. I think that just models a lot of really good clinical thinking and can be really helpful. So let's talk about finally what to look for when you are observing the student. We want to notice, okay, are they building rapport? Are they demonstrating those skills? Are they demonstrating empathy? Or, is it evident that the client has some level of trust for them? Certainly if it's a session where, with a client they've been working with for a while, we should see that there is that rapport already built. We also want to look for the treatment plan and goals to kind of show up in the session. You should know what the treatment goals are. There should be a treatment plan on file. And so do you see those goals coming out in the session, or is it connecting back the interventions that they're doing? Is it connecting back to the treatment plan? Is there evidence in the conversation of kind of referring to the work that's been done? Can you see the progress on the goals so far? Then the kind of arc of the session, does it kind of have a beginning, middle, end type of thing? Is there a pacing that's good? Does the supervisee maintain control of the session well? Does the client appear to be resolved before leaving, or is it kind of abrupt in leaving? How is the time managed at the end, and kind of closing the session well? And then finally, clinical decision making. Is a supervisee able to identify why they made specific clinical decisions as you debrief that with them? Why did you go here instead of here? And they're able to give a rationale for that. But also, can they think of alternatives? Is there something they could have done differently? They should be able to think of some different directions they could have gone. And so, we're looking for that clinical gut, right? It's something that's actually um, a little bit more inherent, maybe caught than taught. That it's the art form of therapy, right? Where we just kind of trust our instincts and we go a direction because it just feels right in the moment. Are you seeing evidence of that building in your student or supervisee? That's really important for their development. So we'll pause there, and then in the next video in this module, we're going to talk about formative evaluation processes. Thanks so much.